This is the show dedicated to raising up the next generation of men of faith and character. My name is Mark Stanifer. Welcome to the Next Man Up. Hey guys, welcome back to the show once again. So good to have you with us. So good to have you part of the community that's raising up this next generation of healthy and godly men, because when we do that, everyone benefits. You know this, my name is Mark Stanifer, and I'm joined once again by my sidekick, Josh Wilson.
Hey.
Good to see you, my friend.
Good to see you.
Thanks for coming back for another episode.
Of course.
What's on your mind today?
Well, I have a young son, and you have older kids. Your two sons just got out of high school, right?
Yep.
And then you have a daughter that's kind of like
I do, sophomore.
Yeah. So my kid isn't that involved in anything right now. He's like 2. Like he doesn't know anything more than what's happening in the living room. But your kids were involved in a bunch of extracurricular activities, right?
Yep.
Like your sons were dancers, and I think your daughter is as well. And they're involved in a bunch of stuff. How did you make sure that you weren't overscheduling them, or overtaxing them, or running them into the ground with activities? How did you help them manage being busy?
The word busy. Yes. So so this conjures up all kinds of different thoughts for me, because we use busyness in a lot of different ways. But I don't know that we always stop and think about how to know if it's too much, right? Like how to know if we're too busy, or the types of activities that we or our kids are engaged in. Is it the right amount? Is it too much? Like this is a good and timely question, I think, especially coming out of this COVID period where lots of things were turned off. They weren't available, and now things may be turning back on again.
Oh, I think they've gotten even weirder, because now there's like this hybrid school thing that a lot of families are doing, and then like how does that fit with like after school activities? And then you're working from home, so how does that work?
That's
like,
right.
It just feels like it's become even more complicated than it was before.
So the opportunity here is to really assess, instead of just, I know the desire is to get back to quote unquote normal, but before we just run right back to the way things used to be, it's an opportunity to assess, right? Like,
yeah, so you can like take stock of like what really is important and what's not important.
Yeah.
So what are some warning signs that your kids are overcommitted, or that they're too scheduled or too busy?
Yeah. Well, we just put an article out on the blog about this, so let's walk through some of those points.
Okay.
That are in the article. And listeners, if you're more of a visual learner, you can go find the article on our website. But here's an interesting one. A good indicator is if your kids are never bored.
Interesting. So, I mean, what's the worst thing that you can hear as a parent is I'm bored.
I know.
Are you saying that's not a bad thing?
I'm saying it's an opportunity. Now, I don't like to hear I'm bored. I didn't like to hear that as a parent. I don't like to say that as a person. But if kids are never bored, then they don't have the opportunity to initiate and create and be creative, and to develop things, activities, interests, pursuits on their own, because it's always so scheduled out for them.
So you're saying a lack of boredom is almost like everything's catered to them.
That's right.
So there's no opportunity for them to invent something new,
or to own their own opportunity or responsibility to decide or choose or engage or not, right? To even unplug.
So it's almost the lack of boredom. You're taking the role of a consumer, that you're just consuming what's given to you instead of being a producer, like making things into existence.
Yeah.
Okay.
I remember as a kid, I know that was a different century and a different culture and different time. I get that.
Different century.
It was back
scary.
in the 1900s.
Oh, that hurts.
I get that. But my brother and I used to make up games and creative stuff all the time. All the time. And it was just a natural expression of us growing up in our boyhood. I think that without opportunity to feel a little bored, our kids today don't have that same drive, that same incentive, that same chance to be creative and invent. And I'm not talking about like creating the next big app necessarily, but there could be that. I'm talking about just simple things, just creating your own activity and engagement rather than having it programmed or piped to you.
So are you saying that we should strip back activities to the point where our kids are constantly complaining about being bored?
No, not at all. Not at all. I'm saying that if your kids are never bored, it could be an indication that you've got too much going on, that they're too programmed, they're too busy with other things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally.
And I'm not saying that just being bored is going to naturally resolve itself into creativity, because there's too many other things to fill that space. For boys in particular, the thing that comes to mind is video games. Like that is an easy activity for boys to go to. And I don't want to rail on video games because there's a place for that, I think. Just creating boredom doesn't automatically mean that they will be creative and invent and do their own thing. But without that, there's not the opportunity.
So you've got to have pauses in your life in order to be creative.
Yep.
In order for creativity just to exist. Period.
That's right. That's right.
That makes sense. So besides boredom, what's another clue that your kids might be a little overscheduled?
So again, back in the 1900s, back when there was Andy Griffith and Father Knows Best and like that time period, which we can look on as kind of this nostalgic ideal time period at times. There was this thing that we did all the time, which was a family mealtime.
Yeah, I mean, I remember growing up with that. I mean, we almost always had dinner together.
Yes.
We kept our day that way. It was breakfast together and dinner together.
Yeah. So as we're asking the question, how do I know if my kids or my family is too busy? How many times do you have a family mealtime during the week?
Yeah, that's really good. We actually started doing this with my son. So he's, like I said, he's 2, so he doesn't get the reasoning behind this yet. But what we had started doing, and this was just from it was a survival instinct really for me and my wife. We'd put him to bed and then we would have dinner. So we'd feed him, put him to bed, and then we would have dinner. And I was looking at that going, well, he never sees us eat dinner. He gets some breakfast with us, but then he's not part of the family thing that we're doing together. So we started, and it took extra work because now we're trying to juggle our son's meltdown period with meal prep. But I think it's worth it because we're actually sitting down and having, more often than not, having dinner at the table, even if he's running around the house because he can't sit still because he's a boy who's 2 years old.
Yep.
The fact that he sees mom and dad stop and sit down at the table and have dinner together and have a discussion feels like we're giving him some sort of template for what life is supposed to look like, that we have these touch points as a family that we're seeing each other every day on purpose.
That's right. It's a connection. It's a grounding into something that you're saying is of value. This is a family value of ours. We're going to gather around the table. Could be breakfast, could be lunch, could be dinner, could be all three. That's probably a little unrealistic. But we're going to gather around the table together and connect over the process of eating.
So how often should you do this? And should you are you thinking about like having like a checkbox, like we had dinner 5 out of 7 nights this week, or 2 out of 7 nights, or what's a good number, do you think? Or is that something that is it not really a number thing, or?
So that's a question that will appeal to certain personalities on the Enneagram scale for sure.
Yeah.
And there is a perspective that says if you don't measure it, if you don't track it, then you can't change it, right? You can't modify it. At the same time, I think this is less prescriptive and more of just this idea of creating that space as a family to come together. There's something like go all the way back into ancient times. There's something about the breaking bread together it's a sacred space, and it can be a sacred space as a family. It can be an important space. It can also be a complete disaster too. Just because you sit down at the table and you're eating at the same time does not equal good, productive family mealtime.
There's a Saturday Night Live skit with Will Ferrell at the table with his wife and daughter. Go look it up. It's so over the top. It's the most dysfunctional family mealtime I've ever seen in my life, and it's hysterical. So you're saying that like just because you're sitting down at the table doesn't necessarily mean it's a healthy situation.
That's right.
But sitting down at the table tends towards health.
It's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to connect, to relate, to discuss, communicate, put the distractions aside, turn the TV off, leave the phones in the other room, right? All those things that would distract otherwise. If you create some boundaries and you engage each other, spouses, kid to kid, kid to parent, parent to kid, if you engage each other, it's an opportunity. Again, the question we're asking is, how do you know if you're too busy? If you're not having meals together, that could be a good indication.
Yeah, and it's not that you're necessarily keeping track or keeping a tally of it, but like stop and think over the last 4 weeks, how many dinner conversations do you remember?
That's right.
If you can't remember them, then you're either not having them or the discussions aren't very good, which might mean that you're not.
Both of those represent opportunities.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. So if we're not really measuring or keeping track of or keeping a tally of meal times, how do we make sure that it happens? I mean, do you put it on the calendar every night at like 6 p.m.? Everyone shows up for dinner? Like how did you make that work with your family?
How do you know where you're supposed to be at any given time?
Well, I mean, it's a calendar.
Right. So if we follow the calendar, one way is to put it on the calendar and just set it aside as protected time for us to be together as a family. Put it on the calendar. And there's so many calendar apps and devices today. Everybody can all be synced on their device, or even pen and paper, old school, the calendar on the refrigerator.
Yeah, like the big one that like...
That's right.
That like is huge and you write on with like a Sharpie marker.
Yeah, exactly. It still works, right? If you're used to adhering to the calendar and you want to protect this, put it on the calendar.
But what happens if like you're using the paper calendar thing and like you can't read the writing anymore because there's so much stuff on the calendar?
Which is also a problem on digital calendars, electronic calendars, right?
Yeah, I mean, especially if it gets truncated into like 3 characters or whatever, because everyone's double booked. That's not efficient.
So again, an indicator of being too busy is just simply to look at the calendar. Do you need 2 or 3 calendars, like a calendar per person, to keep track of where everybody is going?
Yeah, so you're saying that if you had like a calendar for the family as a whole, and then a calendar for you, a calendar for your wife, a calendar for son number 1, son number 2, daughter, like, so you're running around with like 6 different calendars rolling around, plus like a work calendar for you and a work, like that's right. It might be too many.
It might be too many. And the answer isn't to necessarily just collapse them all into one calendar. The point here is you may just have too much going on.
Okay. So maybe it might be worth having a family discussion about not having like 3 different sports events on the same night.
I worked with a client a couple of years ago who was going through a downsizing, if you will, of activity. And he literally sat down with his kids and said, okay, as a family, this is where we're going. We need to back out of some of these activities because of this reason or that reason, some of which we've talked about already. And we need to downsize our calendar. And so he literally had a conversation with each of his kids and said, okay, we're going to put some parameters on what you can do. What doesn't make the cut? What do we have to get out of? And it took a while for him to extricate from all those activities, right? Like the season needed to run its course or whatever. But there was such a sense of freedom for him when he was done because he wasn't so busy. He was able to back out, and it was a collaborative family experience. It wasn't just we're done doing this, right? Because Dad said, or
it wasn't unilateral. It was a family. Like,
that's right.
Did the family as a whole find that as a positive experience?
Yes. Yeah. There was emotions, right? Like some of the kids were a little disappointed to have to let go of those things. But once they settled into the new routine and new schedule, it's like, oh yeah, we're realizing the benefits of why we did this. So yes, it wasn't unilateral. It was a discussion. It was an intentional, collaborative family process.
Well, I mean, all those activities cost a lot of money. I mean, if you want to get involved in sports, like you're going to have to buy uniforms, and if you're really serious about it, you'll be taking like private coaching stuff. Like I know my niece is really, really into lacrosse. She actually made a travel lacrosse team as an 8th grader, which is like unheard of.
Yeah.
And there's like tons of money that goes into doing this stuff. I can't imagine if you had like 3 kids doing 3 sports each, like super book like that. That's got to be expensive.
Yeah.
I mean, is that a consideration when you think about how busy?
So I think there's 2 things in our lives that are tremendous insight into what we value and what we prioritize. One of which we've talked about is the calendar. Mm-hmm. The other is the checking account. I used to say checkbook. Nobody uses checkbooks anymore, right? The checking account.
Yeah.
The Apple Pay account. I think that's a tremendous window into what you value. But here's the thing. Mark is not saying, and I don't think Josh is saying this either, that we shouldn't spend money on our kids to expose them to different activities.
No, and I'm not like, in regards to my niece, that's like the one thing that they really like invest in is this beginning of a career in lacrosse for her. Like she wants to go on and play collegiate level. I mean, she's into this thing, and that's the thing that they spend money on.
But here's the sign where it maybe has gone awry. If you don't have the money. Now, we could go do a whole different episode on money management and budgeting and all that. But if you're just swiping the card in order to finance these activities, that's a good indication of maybe a couple different things, but at least that your kids are doing too much because you just don't have the money to afford it.
So if you're going into debt to make sure your kids aren't bored, you're probably doing something wrong.
That's right. That's a much better way to say it. Thank you. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think maybe just the last one that we'll toss out here, and I guess before we get to this, what's occurring to me, Josh, is that we're talking about how to recognize that you might be out of balance with activities, overscheduled, over busy.
Yeah.
It might not hurt to delve into some of the reasons why and explore that a little bit more, because there's lots of different thoughts I have on that. Maybe that's another episode that we can get to.
Yeah.
So the last point that I think is worthy of making is this, and in particular, when kids are younger and you have more influence and control over what they do or what they don't do, are you exhausted as a parent running them from thing to thing to thing to thing?
Well, aren't parents always tired?
I know. It's a state of being as a parent, and it's part of the job description I get. But some of it is self-imposed. I've been telling one of my kids lately that tired is partly a choice.
Interesting. Okay. Tell me more about that, because I'm really tired right now.
And I get it. Your boy's too, and he needs a lot of you physically. But part of the reason parents are so exhausted is because they're playing Uber and DoorDash and mom and coach and on and on and on and on for so many different activities and things that they're energy depleted. Now, I'm an introvert. I like time by myself. I protect my energy. So I get that there are some personality things in play here. But if you want an indication of whether or not your kids are too busy, take a look at how exhausted you are.
So maybe this comes all the way back to the beginning of our conversation. If you're not bored, your kids might be too busy.
Yeah. Which I think, I mean, we can unpack some of this in another episode, but we culturally right now, in the world in which we live today, it seems to celebrate and reward busyness.
Mm-hmm.
And often that busyness is not really growth and productive and developmental. It's just frenetic pace and all kinds of activities.
Yeah, I mean, the phrase that everyone responds with when they're asked, like, how are you doing? Busy.
Right.
I mean, that's like how the conversations go, right?
Right. That's right.
Maybe that's not a good thing.
Yeah.
Maybe it might be better to say sometimes, I'm bored.
That's right.
I'm actually taking a little bit of a rest, and I'm not that busy at the moment.
Yeah. That feels weird in today's culture. It might even feel or seem unrealistic to accomplish. But back to calendar and money, they're an indication of what you believe, where your priorities are and what you're choosing to do with those two resources. Both of them are limited, by the way, right? We all have the same 24 hours in a day. We don't all have the same money, but we can't produce money with the snap of fingers. Both of them are limited resources and, arguably need to be invested well.
Yeah, I agree.
All right. So teasing out this idea of how to know if your kids are too busy. Again, we've been working through some of the thoughts that are out on the blog article. If you're interested, you can find it at thenextmanup.com/blog. We'll also invite you, as we often do, if you have any feedback, suggestions, questions, whatever, you can email us at feedback@thenextmanup.com. But the challenge here is to honestly look, especially coming out of this externally imposed slowdown, to honestly look at your schedule and are your kids too busy? And maybe the answer is yes. And if the answer is yes, then begin to make steps to create some space to experience that boredom, not for boredom's sake, but for your sake as a parent and to help your kids have creative space to grow and to develop.
That's good. Yeah.
All right. Well, that's it. We'll call it a wrap. Josh, always good to be with you. Thanks for your thoughts and guiding us today with your questions and suggestions.
You know it. Always happy to be here. And
listeners, thanks for being with us. You know the drill. We'll be back next week. And until then, we'll say
adios.
Hey, listeners, thanks for journeying with us on this Next Man Up podcast. We would love to hear from you. Maybe you have a question or an idea, perhaps a topic for us to consider. If that's you and you want to reach out to us, you can get us at feedback@thenextmanup.com. That's feedback@thenextmanup.com. Again, we'd love to hear from you. Until next time, we'll see you later.